It all started with a gut feeling. You know, that little voice in your head that tells you something's off, even when everything seems fine on the surface. I ignored it at first. After all, Sarah and I had been married for 10 years. We had 2 beautiful kids, a house, and what I thought was a solid relationship. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't? I never imagined she'd betray me, let alone with someone so close to me, my own brother, Mark. Mark and I had always been close. Growing up, we were inseparable. He was my best friend, my confidant, the person I trusted more than anyone else. When Sarah and I got married, he was my best man. He even joked at our wedding, "If you ever mess up, I'll be there to take care of her." We all laughed. It was just a joke. At least, that's what I thought. The first red flag came about 6 months ago. Mark had been coming over more often, usually when I was at work. He said he was helping Sarah with stuff around the house, fixing the sink, mowing the lawn, things like that. I didn't think much of it. After all, he was family. But then, I started noticing little things. The way Sarah's face lit up when he walked into the room. The way they'd laugh at inside jokes I didn't understand. The way she'd dress up a little more on the days he was supposed to come over. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mark was my brother. Sarah was my wife. They wouldn't do that to me. But the doubts kept creeping in, especially when Sarah started acting distant. She'd spend hours on her phone, and whenever I walked into the room, she'd quickly put it away. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say it was just her mom or a friend, but something about the way she avoided eye contact made me suspicious. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone still in her hand. I carefully pried it from her fingers and unlocked it. My heart raced as I scrolled through her messages. And there it was, proof of the betrayal I'd been dreading. Messages between her and Mark, filled with words that made my stomach churn. They weren't just friendly. They were intimate, full of secrets and lies. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands shook as I read through their conversations. They'd been meeting up behind my back, sneaking around like teenagers. Mark would come over when I was at work, and they'd spend hours together. They even talked about me, mocking me for being so clueless. The worst part was when I found out it had been going on for over a year. A whole year of lies, right under my nose. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to confront them both right then and there. But I couldn't. The kids were asleep upstairs, and the last thing I wanted was to drag them into this mess. So I sat there staring at Sarah's phone, feeling like my whole world had just fallen apart. The next morning, I confronted Sarah. At first, she denied it, saying I was overreacting, but when I showed her the messages, she broke down. She said it wasn't supposed to happen, that it just did. She claimed she still loved me, that it was a mistake. But how could I believe her? How could I ever trust her again? As for Mark, I haven't spoken to him since. He's tried calling, texting, even showing up at the house. But I can't face him. The betrayal cuts too deep. He was my brother, my best friend, and he stabbed me in the back. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him. Now, I'm stuck in this nightmare, trying to figure out what to do next. Do I stay and try to work things out with Sarah for the sake of the kids? Or do I walk away and start over? I don't have the answers yet, but one thing's for sure. Nothing will ever be the same. The days after the discovery felt like living in a fog. Every morning I'd wake up hoping it was just a bad dream, but the reality would hit me all over again. Sarah and I were barely speaking. She'd cry and beg for forgiveness, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. Even the kids could sense something was wrong. My daughter, Emma, who's only 7, kept asking, "Daddy, why are you so sad?" I didn't know how to answer her. How do you explain to a child that their mom and uncle have shattered your world? I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. I replayed every moment from the past year, trying to figure out how I missed the signs. The late-night work calls Sarah had to take, the sudden interest in going to the gym, the way she'd always defend Mark whenever I joked about him being single. It all made sense now, and it made me feel like a fool. Mark, on the other hand, was relentless. He kept calling and texting, begging me to talk to him. He even showed up at my office one day, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Please, just hear me out," he said, his voice trembling. I wanted to punch him, to scream at him, but I just stood there, numb. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear," I told him before walking away. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. This was the guy I'd shared everything with. Our childhood, our dreams, our secrets. And now, he was a stranger. Sarah and I started couples therapy, but it felt like we were just going through the motions. The therapist kept talking about rebuilding trust, but how do you rebuild something that's been completely destroyed? Every session felt like ripping off a bandage, exposing raw wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. Sarah would cry and apologize, and I'd sit there, silent, wondering if I'd ever be able to forgive her. Meanwhile, the kids were struggling too. Emma started having nightmares, and my son, Liam, who's only 5, became clingy and anxious. They didn't understand why Daddy was sleeping in the guest room, or why Uncle Mark didn't come around anymore. I tried to shield them from the truth, but kids are smarter than we give them credit for. They knew something was wrong, and it broke my heart to see them hurting because of the mess Sarah and Mark had created. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I found Sarah sitting on the couch, staring at a photo of us from our wedding day. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to hurt our family." For a moment, I almost believed her, but then I remembered the messages, the lies, the way she and Mark had laughed at me behind my back. The anger came rushing back, and I had to walk away before I said something I'd regret. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel like I was living 2 separate lives. On the surface, I was trying to keep it together for the kids, going to work, helping with homework, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. I couldn't focus at work, and I started drinking more than I should. My friends noticed, but I didn't want to talk about it. How could I explain that my wife had cheated on me with my own brother? It was too humiliating, too painful. Then, one day, something happened that changed everything. I was at the grocery store picking up stuff for dinner when I ran into an old friend from college. We got to talking, and before I knew it, I was pouring my heart out to her. She listened without judgment, and for the first time in months, I felt like someone truly understood what I was going through. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said. "You deserve to be happy, and if staying in this marriage is making you miserable, maybe it's time to think about moving on." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of leaving Sarah. It wasn't an easy thought. I loved her, or at least, I loved the person I thought she was. But I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. I owed it to myself and to my kids to find a way to be happy again. But before I could make any decisions, something happened that turned my world upside down once again. Sarah came home one night, looking pale and shaken. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. What now? Had she been seeing Mark again? Was she leaving me? I braced myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "And I don't know if it's yours or Mark's." When Sarah told me she was pregnant, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me all over again. I just stood there, staring at her, unable to process what she'd just said. Pregnant. And it might not even be mine. The room spun, and I had to sit down before my legs gave out. Sarah was crying, begging me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. For weeks, I'd been trying to figure out if I could forgive her, if we could somehow move past this. But now, this changed everything. A baby. A child who might not even be mine. How was I supposed to handle that? How could I raise a kid who might be the product of the ultimate betrayal? And what if it was mine? Could I love a child who would always remind me of this nightmare? Sarah and I barely spoke after that. She moved into the guest room, and the house felt like a war zone. The kids were confused and scared, and I didn't know how to explain any of it to them. Emma kept asking why. Mommy was crying all the time, and Liam started wetting the bed again. It broke my heart to see them like this. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know how to fix myself. Mark, of course, found out about the pregnancy. He showed up at the house one night, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," he said, his voice shaking. I didn't want to let him in, but I knew this conversation was inevitable. We sat in the living room, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mark kept apologizing, saying he never meant for any of this to happen, that he never wanted to hurt me. But the damage was done. He'd betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now there was a baby involved. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in this limbo of anger and heartbreak. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Sarah and I decided to get a paternity test. It was the only way to know for sure, and we both agreed it was necessary. The waiting was agony. Every day felt like a year, and I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the worst-case scenarios. What if the baby was Mark's? What if it was mine? What if Sarah decided to leave me for him? The uncertainty was eating me alive. When the results finally came in, Sarah and I sat down together to open them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the envelope. I took a deep breath and tore it open. The words on the page hit me like a punch to the gut. The baby was mine. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was numb. This was supposed to be good news, but it didn't change the fact that Sarah had betrayed me. It didn't change the fact that my brother had been involved. It didn't change the fact that our family was broken. Sarah started crying again, saying this was our chance to start over, to fix what we'd broken. But I didn't know if I could do it. The trust was gone, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. I loved her, but I didn't know if that was enough. In the end, I decided to stay, for now. Not because I was sure it was the right thing to do, but because I didn't know what else to do. The kids needed stability, and I needed time to figure things out. Sarah and I started therapy again, and we're taking it one day at a time. It's not easy, and there are days when I want to walk away and never look back. But for now, I'm trying. As for Mark, I haven't spoken to him since that night. He's tried reaching out, but I'm not ready to face him. Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive him, but not now. The wounds are still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. This whole experience has changed me in ways I never expected. I'm not the same person I was before all of this happened, and I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm trying to move forward, one step at a time. For my kids, for myself, and for the baby who's on the way. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you stay and try to make it work, or would you walk away? How would you handle the paternity test and the aftermath? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear what you think. This has been one of the hardest journeys of my life, and I'm still figuring it out as I go. Thank you for listening.